Welcome back. So we just learned what Node is, kind of. We're still working there, but the other piece of information that we need to solve is what is a JavaScript runtime? Because Node is a JavaScript runtime. It's not a programming language, it's not a framework, it's a runtime. So let's demystify that. What is a runtime? Now, this idea of a runtime, we're going to deep dive into it a little bit later in the course, so I'm just going to skim the surface. But you can think of it as a JavaScript environment. An environment that allows us to run JavaScript as well as do some extra stuff. Now, the way Node works is that it has the V8 engine, which, as we learned, makes our JavaScript code run really efficiently. And every time the Google engineers upgrade the V8 engine, which is very often, well, Node automatically gets faster and faster with each improvement in the V8 engine. So automatic performance boost just by that. But in order for it to do a lot more than just read JavaScript, it might want to do different things. Maybe read files, maybe access databases, maybe just run some things that aren't part of the V8 engine, aren't part of JavaScript. And that's where this libuv comes in. You see, Node.js in a simplified form is simply a way for us to give a JavaScript file to the Node.js runtime. It's going to go through the V8 engine, it's going to read the JavaScript, and anytime it sees something that maybe isn't part of JavaScript, it's going to communicate with this libuv library with a cool dinosaur logo. But what does it mean? Well, we can just simply Google libuv. Libuv is a multi-platform C library that provides support for asynchronous I/O based on event loops. Don't worry, we'll cover that later in the course. It's essentially a library that allows us to do some really neat features with Node.js that make it great for things like web servers, things that we're going to build throughout the course. If we actually go to the Node.js GitHub repo, which anybody can access because it's open source, and we go into the source folder, you'll actually see that at the bottom, we're going to access the README that says Node.js C++ codebase. And you can read about this if you really want to dive deep. But essentially, what Node and Ryan Dahl did was combine the V8 engine and this libuv, which is written in C++. V8 engine is written with JavaScript and C++, and he created the bindings between them so that they can communicate. So that whenever they encounter something that maybe needs asynchronous I/O, well, then we hand it over to the libuv. Now, I know this is kind of confusing, and we're going to dive deeper into this topic, but that's what Node is. A JavaScript runtime is an environment for us to run JavaScript that gives us a little bit more than just the V8 engine. Now, let me ask you another question. Is a web browser a JavaScript runtime? Pause the video and think about it. Based on what you learned, is JavaScript a runtime? Well, let's do a quick search here. Is web browser a JavaScript runtime? Wow, good sentencing on my part. All right, so we go to Stack Overflow. Looks like this person has the exact same question as us. And if we go to the answer, we see a browser contains a JavaScript engine. Hey, we know what that means. And the engine implements a JavaScript runtime, which includes call stack, heap, and event loop. Don't worry, we're going to learn about those soon. The browser also usually includes a set of APIs that augment the JavaScript runtime and make asynchronous blah, 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 blah. In a sense, yes, the web browser is a JavaScript runtime, right? If we go to our console, we can actually run code that isn't part of JavaScript. For example, console.log isn't actually part of the JavaScript specification. It's just something that the browsers allow us to do. Things like alert, well, those are very web specific. the browser implements this alert feature that we can use. And all of these are part of what we call the window object in the browser. The window object is a set of tools that the browsers give us that we can use that aren't part of JavaScript, but allow us to have multiple functionalities. So it's a JavaScript runtime. Remember, the V8 engine combined with some extra functionality. In the same sense, with Node.js, we have that functionality, except because it's not a browser, in Node.js, if you do window, you're going to get an error. In Node.js, we have something called global instead of the window. But if I do it here, I get an error because the browser doesn't know about global. Don't worry, we're going to dive into this specific thing in the next video. But before I keep talking, I want to go back to what we've learned up until now. How do you run JavaScript? Well, you need a runtime. You need some sort of an JavaScript engine and a runtime to be able to run the code. And that's what Node does. So how do you run JavaScript outside of the browser? You need to download a set of features so that your computer understands what JavaScript is, what you want to do. Node is, in a way, just a set of tools for us to write our applications. That application uses the V8 engine to read the JavaScript, and anytime there's something that requires some sort of things like worker threads, event queues, event loops, again, something we'll cover later on, well, we use the libuv library, and Ryan Dahl created these bindings for us that communicates between V8 and libuv. So that now we're able to write JavaScript, gets read by the V8 engine, and then gets sent back to libuv. But we don't have to worry about what's underneath the hood. We can just run JavaScript code. And by the way, this is exactly how it works with other programming languages as well. For example, if you wanted to run Python, my computer doesn't know what Python is. Yes, maybe it might be pre-installed on my computer when I bought it, but most likely, if I write Python and throw it to the computer is going to say, "Who are you? I don't even know what that means." So just like we will in the next couple of videos, we need to actually install Node.js so that we can download these tools to run JavaScript outside of the browser. In the same way, if I wanted to, let's say, code in Python, I'd have to go to the python.org website and then download Python, or the Python, what we call interpreter, so that my computer can read Python code. Now let's take a break here. I know we're covering a lot. Your brain might be a mush right now, but don't worry, everything's gonna fall into place bit by bit. For now, grab a cup of coffee and I'll see you in the next one.